Today in economics class, you're going to be learning 5 things. Number one, you're going to be able to explain where paper money came from. Second, you're going to be able to explain fractional reserve banking. Third, you're going to be able to explain why governments started issuing paper money. Fourth, you're going to be able to evaluate the differences between paper money and metallic money. And fifth, you're going to be able to summarize the history of the gold standard in the United States. So where did paper money come from? While gold and silver are really great forms of money, they do have a couple of downsides. Number one, large numbers of coins, gold and silver coins, are unwieldy and unsafe to transport. Number two, bullion, which is gold, silver, or platinum that's not in coin form, instead is in the form of maybe plates or ingots or bars or something like that. They are even harder to transport. So to make gold and silver easier to handle, bankers in Western Europe, starting in about the 16th century, about the 1500s, began holding on to deposits of gold and silver for the depositors. And the banks would then issue receipts that would state that the depositors had a particular amount of gold or silver in the bank. And then the depositors would hold on to these receipts. Then they could turn in those receipts to withdraw their metallic money or their bullion whenever they wanted to. Now the depositors soon realized that it was actually a lot easier just to trade these banknotes than it was, or these bank receipts, than it was actually to use the gold itself. And we're going to see a good example of that here next. So imagine that you are a sheep farmer living just outside London in the year 1610. Your name is James. Now, you have been at this for quite some time, and you have accrued quite a bit of gold, and you have stored that gold by depositing it in the Royal Bank of London. So, one cold fall day, you decide that it's time for you to make your annual trek around the countryside, buying up wheat to be able to feed to your sheep during the long winter months when they can't eat hay or can't eat grass. So you go to your desk and you take out of your desk 5 different receipts that have been issued to you from the Royal Bank. Each of the receipts says that you have 10 pounds of gold in the Royal Bank, so for a total of 50 pounds of gold. And you think that you probably need about 50 pounds of gold to buy all of the wheat that you're going to be buying that day. So you take these 5 different receipts totaling 50 pounds, you put them in your pocket, and then you go outside and you hitch up your horse to your cart and you head down the muddy road into London. You get to the Royal Bank, you go inside, and you give them your receipts totaling 50 pounds of gold, and they literally give you 50 pounds worth of gold. And so you take your 50 pounds of gold outside, you put it in your cart, and you spend the rest of the day going from one farmer to the next, buying up wheat. By the end of the day, you have a big, whopping amount of wheat in the back of your cart, and you have 7 pounds left. But the bank is closed. So you go home. You get out to your barn, it's after dark, and you unload all of the wheat. You take the 7 pounds of gold in a little bag, and you start heading inside. Now, as you're heading inside, a couple of guys in masks say, "Hey, we've been watching you all day, and we want your gold." And so then they tie you up to a tree, and they take your gold. The last you see of it, it's disappearing over the hill as the 3 masked guys are laughing. Okay, so let's move forward a little bit here to 1 year later. Now, 1 year later, you once again need to make your annual trek to go get a bunch of grain so your sheep can make it through the winter while they can't eat grass. And so once again, you go to your desk drawer and you get out 5 10-pound receipts from the Royal Bank of London. You go outside, you hitch up your horse to your cart, you make your way into the bank. But on the way, you begin to think, last year, I had to carry around 50 pounds of gold. And that was actually kind of tough. It was 50 pounds, which I can lift, but having 50 pounds of gold in my cart all day is kind of a dumb idea. And not only that, but I got 7 pounds stolen because it's easy to steal these pieces of gold. So I wonder if I couldn't just take my receipts and use those receipts to pay off each of the wheat farmers. And so you try it. You go to the first wheat farmer, whose name is Bob, and you say, "Hey Bob, is there any chance I could just give you this receipt and that would work for me to pay for your wheat?" And Bob says, "Hey, can't see why not." And so Bob goes and he takes the receipt and gives you all the wheat. And you go from one wheat farmer to the next all day, and you just give them these receipts instead of giving them the actual gold. It saves you a trip to the bank, and it also saves you from getting robbed of your gold. It's a whole lot easier just to hide the paper. So you head on home, and you unload the grain. It's once again dark, and this time you're again confronted by these three masked guys who say, "Hey, it's your annual trip. We know you've got gold. Give us your gold. What's left?" And this time you laugh all the way to the bank, I guess, because you don't have any gold on you. You instead have a little receipt that's still tucked inside your pocket, and these guys aren't smart enough to realize they can just steal the receipt instead. Meanwhile, Bob, the wheat farmer, takes your receipt and puts it in his desk drawer. And the next day, Bob's wife, Kate, let's see, what are we gonna call her? I had a name for her. Well, guess not. Let's call her Steffi. Let's call her Steffi. So Bob's wife, Steffi, says, "Hey, Bob, I need you to run to town, and I need you to get me a whole bunch of candles." And so Bob gets the receipt from his desk drawer and is making his way to the Royal Bank to go get the gold. And he thinks, "You know what? I wonder if the candle maker would be okay with just taking this receipt as payment as well." And the candle maker says, "Yeah, sure, I'll do that." And so that's how these receipts actually became paper money. It's just so much easier just to use these receipts than it is to use paper money. And that's how they became paper money. But one thing to really recall here is that this paper money always represented metallic money or bullion that was kept in banks. Let's move on to number 2. Number 2 is fractional reserve banking. So as these early banks held on to the gold and silver deposits, they began to realize that not everyone was coming to the banks to redeem their gold and silver receipts at the same time. And they began to realize that they could actually lend out about 80% or so of the deposits to people who needed to borrow money from them. They could charge interest for that, and that's how that they could really make money. They could even pass some of this interest that they were making back to the people who had deposited money, and that would keep them happy once they realized that their money was actually being lent out to other people. So let's look at a little scenario of this. Let's go back to the example world in which you're John, the sheep farmer, and you have James the sheep farmer, and you have your money at the Royal Bank of London. So let's say that the Royal Bank of London, you, James, have 10,000 pounds of gold deposited. Now let's say that Bob, the wheat farmer, hears of this great opportunity to buy the farm next door. The farm next door is owned by a guy named John, and John is getting old, and he wants to retire and move into a little house in London where he doesn't need to farm anymore. So John decides to sell his farm for 5,000 pounds. Now, Bob, the wheat farmer, doesn't have 5,000 pounds. He needs to borrow the money. So Bob goes into the Royal Bank of London, and he asks them, "Hey, could I borrow 5,000 pounds from you?" And the Royal Bank says, "Yeah, we'll go ahead and do that. We've done business with you for years, and so sure, we'll give you 5,000 pounds. Sure." And so the Royal Bank takes 5,000 pounds out of the 10,000 pounds that you, James, have in the bank, and they give it to Bob. Bob takes the 5,000 pounds and gives it to John for the farm. And Bob is very happy to now own another farm. John is very happy because he now gets to move to the city where he doesn't have to work as hard anymore, and he can spend the rest of his days going to coffee houses or something, doing whatever they did back in the 1600s as retirees. Maybe they played bingo. So what John does with those 5,000 pounds that he's been given is he takes them straight back to the Royal Bank of London. Straight back to the Royal Bank of London, and he deposits it there. And next, a guy named Greg, who's the candle maker, has an unfortunate accident, and his candle shop burns down. And it really burns down because he makes candles, right? So Greg, the candle maker's shop, has burned down, and he needs £2,000 to be able to rebuild his shop. So he goes to the Royal Bank, and he asks the Royal Bank, hey, any chance I could borrow £2,000? The Royal Bank says, yeah, go ahead. We've done business with you for years. We'll go ahead and give you £2,000. And they take the £2,000 out of the £5,000 deposit that John, who just sold his farm, has made. Now, this is a little bit hard to keep track of, and so I want to show you a couple of things by putting a chart up here on the board. Of course, a chart. All right, so we are going to look at a few things here. First, we're going to be looking at the money that James, which is you, has in the bank, and we're going to be looking at the money that John, who is the wheat farmer, has in the bank. We're going to be comparing it along a couple of different levels. First, we're going to look at how much money is actually deposited in the bank by James and by John. Second, we're going to look at how much of this money that's been deposited has been lent out by the bank. Third, we're going to look at how much money is actually in the bank. And then fourth, we're going to look at how much money is in circulation. And that means how much money is in the bank and is actually being used right now. So let's take a look at this. All right, first, you, James, have £10,000 in the bank. So we're going to go ahead and write £10,000 there. Okay, now the bank took 5,000 of those pounds and lent it out. Therefore, we have £5,000 lent out. Now, how much is actually in the bank right now? Well, obviously, it's 10,000 minus 5,000, and so we have another £5,000 in the bank. Now, how much money is actually in circulation? Well, actually, the amount of money in circulation is £10,000, because that's how much you could actually go. You could go to the bank and say, hey, I want my £10,000, and they would actually give you £10,000, even though 5,000 of those pounds are actually lent out. Okay? They would do that. And so in circulation, there's actually this amount plus this amount, which is £15,000. Okay, now let's take a look at John's scenario. So John deposited £5,000. And interestingly, it's actually these £5,000 from right here, right? So John deposited £5,000, and they immediately lent out 2,000 of those pounds to Greg, the candle maker. How much is actually in the bank? What's actually in the bank is the difference between this and this, which is £3,000. Okay, so how much money does this transaction leave in circulation? Well, it's this plus this, which is £7,000. Now let's take a look at a couple of totals here. How much money was deposited in total? Well, it's £15,000. How much money was lent out? £7,000. How much money is currently actually in the bank? That would be £8,000. And how much money is actually in circulation? That would be £22,000. This is called fractional reserve banking. Why? It's because the bank only actually reserves a fraction of the money that it says it has on hand. So it says it actually has $15,000 on hand, while actually it has lent out $7,000, and it really only has a fraction of its money on hand. And so the money that is effectively in circulation is actually this number right here, $22,000. That's how fractional reserve banking works. Now, the numbers that I'm working with here in your example are actually not really realistic numbers, because what actually happens today is that banks only hold on to somewhere between 10 and 15% of the money that has been deposited. So if you deposit $1,000 into your local savings account, the bank is going to turn around and they're going to lend out about 900 to between $800 and $900 probably of that to somebody else. But if you want your money, you go into the bank and they will give you your entire $1,000. Why is that? Well, it's because somebody else has also deposited money, and that somebody else is not asking for their money back at that exact same time. So this whole fractional reserve banking system only works as long as not everybody is demanding their money at the same time. Okay, that's fractional reserve banking. Let's move on to our third topic for today, which is government-issued paper money. And let me go ahead. I'll just leave that there. Just ignore it. Government-issued paper money. The gold and silver receipts were initially issued only by private banks, meaning banks that were not associated with the government. However, governments soon saw how much easier it was to actually pay for stuff using receipts or paper money instead of hard currency. And so they set up their own government banks and began issuing their own bank receipts. These receipts became what's called legal tender, which means a form of payment that has been declared a valid means of payment. It also means that everyone is now forced to accept that as a means of payment. The important thing to remember here is that the paper money that was tied to these government banks was just that, tied directly to the government banks. There were still other banks out there that were non-government banks. And these government banks were also issuing their own paper money. So let's say you lived in the United States back in like the 1820s. During that time, you would have had the Bank of the United States issuing money that is going to look something similar to what we use today, which is money that's coming from the United States government. But you also would have had lots of other banks who were also issuing their own paper money. It's a very confusing scenario. It's hard for us to understand. Eventually, though, the currency that was issued by modern governments became so pervasive that all other banks quit issuing their own paper money and began using the government's money only. But there's actually nothing out there that says that a bank can't just issue its own currency, I believe. Anyway, as far as I know. Who's calling?
I don't know.
All right, sorry about that. Somebody was calling my phone and then it cut off the camera while I did that. Okay, so we're just saying that there's no particular reason why banks can't actually issue their own currencies today, but there's really no point in doing it because everyone trusts the national currencies like the dollar and the euro to a large degree. However, there has been a very interesting movement in the last 5 to 10 years toward cryptocurrencies. And you can fairly easily buy cryptocurrencies and you can use the cryptocurrencies to buy certain things. I've actually done it because I have bought cryptocurrencies, and my brother-in-law, Justin Smooker, invests in cryptocurrencies. And so he's willing to have me pay whenever he is selling a pig or a beef. He is allowing me to pay for that beef or pig, the cow or pig, through cryptocurrencies. And so they are becoming more and more popular. And it's very interesting because cryptocurrencies are not tied to any particular government. So we're kind of moving back in the direction again of having currencies that are not backed by the government. Okay, number 4. Let's move on to topic number 4, which is comparing metallic money and paper money. Okay, so let's take a look here at these 6 different qualities of money that were laid out in the first section of this chapter. So, what were they? Number 1, portability. Two, durability. Okay, Can you recall these without, while I'm putting them up here? Number 3, it's homogeneity. Looking the same. Number 4 is divisibility. Number 5 is constancy, which means the value stays the same, tends to stay the same. And then number 6 is intrinsic value. I'll just call it intrinsic V. Okay, we're going to put in this column metal for metal money, and over here we'll have paper for paper money. Okay, now all I'm going to do here is I'm going to say more or less. Or actually, let me just go ahead and put a plus sign or a minus sign in each of these blanks. And all it means is we're comparing these two to each other, and we're saying which one is more or less of this particular quality, right? We're just comparing these two. So first off, how about portability? Well, in this case, the plus is going to go to paper. Paper is lighter, and it's actually easier to transport. Metal, while it's not that difficult to transport, it is less easy to port around than paper. So we're gonna compare it that way here. How about durability? Well, in this case, metal money is actually quite a bit more durable than paper money. So like I gave that example of the $5 bill that was torn almost in half. And so paper is obviously far easier to destroy than metal is. How about homogeneity? Well, in this case, they're actually going to be equal, because homogeneity really depends on who is issuing the money. And so in this case, they're pretty much equally homogeneous. How about divisibility? Well, this is the same. It's going to be equal. It all depends on who's actually doing the issuing. Okay, how about constancy, holding on to its value? Well, in this case, metal is going to be quite a bit more constant than paper money. And then how about intrinsic value? Well, in this case, metal is going to be quite a bit more intrinsically valuable than paper. So, in summary, metal money has an infinitely greater intrinsic value, because metal is actually worth something. It can actually accomplish things, and it has sort of this built-in value to humans, while paper has no particular value to humans. So there's an infinitely greater intrinsic value in metal money than paper money. However, paper money is infinitely easier to issue or to print, because metal money is scarce. And so that really is the argument between paper and metal money, in that metal money can only be produced as long as there's actually metals to be mined. Since there's a finite amount of metal to be mined, it means that there's only so much money that can actually be in circulation. Now, historically, that has actually led to some pretty serious problems. Like here in the United States, toward the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s, there were some serious problems for farmers who had a hard time getting their hands on metal money. In fact, actually, off the top of my head, I can recount at least 3 or 4 different instances throughout the 1800s where farmers had a very difficult time getting their hands on metal money, just because it's just so scarce. And so paper money has been able to alleviate a lot of the stress that financial systems that are entirely based off of gold or silver are under. However, the issue is that paper money is infinitely more easy to print. Therefore, rampant inflation can take place, in which prices skyrocket because there's way too much money in circulation. So that is kind of the interesting part of of modern life. Hang on one second. Okay, sorry about that. I had to pause for just a bit to take care of something. Okay, so let's see here. Where was I? Lost my train of thought. Paper money. Ah, yes. The interesting scenario that we find ourselves in our modern times is how we can have a currency that is not actually backed by gold. So let's go ahead and go to our final lesson for today, which is the A, B, C, D, E. Yeah, okay. The gold standard, number 5, the gold standard in the United States. So here is the history of the gold standard. Any paper money that was issued by the United States government was redeemable for gold until the presidency of Andrew Jackson in the 1830s. The reason that that government money was no longer redeemable for gold at that point was that Andrew Jackson actually got rid of the Bank of the United States, which meant that the government was no longer had a bank to issue money through. So this remained that way until Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln was the first president who issued money that was not backed by gold. And there's this really great story in which Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, is meeting with several of his cabinet members, and they are talking about a new kind of bill that they're going to be producing called greenbacks, because they were green. And you possibly have even used that term, greenbacks, to mean money. But they were first used during the Civil War. And this was sort of toward the end of the Civil War, when the United States government had really spent a tremendous amount of money fighting the war, and they were very, very low on silver and gold. And Abraham Lincoln was meeting with some of his cabinet members to discuss what sort of design should go on these greenbacks. And they were looking for a slogan. And Abraham Lincoln, who had a really great sense of humor, proposed that they would put a Bible verse on it. And he proposed that the Bible verse they put on it would be from the book of Acts, which is, I believe, John saying to the crippled man, "Silver and gold have I none, but such as I have give I thee." Anyway, I thought that's really funny. It's pretty witty for the president to say that. Okay, so greenbacks were the first government currency that was not backed by silver or gold. And these greenbacks were printed specifically, and I meant to mention this earlier when I was talking about the paper money that governments were issuing. I may have, but I don't think I made a big enough point about it. But the whole point behind governments issuing paper money longer ago was to give the governments a way to pay for their own expenses. So like these greenbacks were printed to allow the government to pay for the expenses of running the war. However, what then happened is that this money went into circulation, that obviously more people than just the government got their hands on this paper money, and so everyone began using this paper money. But it was initially intended to be used for the government to pay its expenses. Okay, so the greenbacks then eventually went away, and they actually were successful. They worked well, even though they weren't backed by gold. Well, it worked okay. They retained about as much value as one greenback dollar was worth about as much as one gold-backed dollar during the Civil War. Then the greenbacks did go away, and any money that was issued by the U.S. government was backed by gold. Up until then, 1913, President Woodrow Wilson established the banking system that we know today, the Federal Reserve System. And let me see if I have my wallet here in my backpack. It looks like I don't. I think I left it in the car. Well, too bad. If you look at a piece of money you have today, you'll notice that it says Federal Reserve on it. And so that is the money we have today is part of the new Federal Reserve System, which was established in 1913 by Woodrow Wilson. And this money was backed by gold all the way up until like the mid-1960s, when there were gold supply problems and the U.S. government decided to go off of the gold standard. So up until the mid-1960s, you could have walked into a bank with a dollar bill and said, "Could I please have the $1 worth of gold?" And they would have given you that gold, I suppose. I don't know how prevalently people actually did that, but theoretically, you could have done that. If you'd walk into a bank today with a dollar bill and say, "Hey, I want $1 worth of gold," they would say, "Yeah, we don't do that anymore. We don't use the gold standard anymore." So the question then is, what backs up your money? What is your paper money what's actually giving your paper money some value if it's not backed up by gold? Well, the answer is it's just your faith and my faith and your neighbor's faith and everybody else's faith in the U.S. government and the government's money, the U.S. dollar. You are betting that the U.S. government and its dollar are going to remain stable today, tomorrow, and into the future as long as you live. And that money is going to be able to buy about the same amount of stuff as today, as you move into the future. And so people just trust the dollar, and they don't say it has to be backed up by anything else. They just trust it intrinsically. So does that scare you? It does scare some people. And some people argue that we should go back onto the gold standard. But other people argue that no, that would simply hold back our economy. So this non-gold backed currency that the U.S. is using now has worked for at least 50 years. And I hope that it will work for at least 50 more throughout my lifetime. But we'll see how this whole non-precious metal-backed currency is going to work out in the future. Your assignment for today is to read 9.4 and answer the questions. Read 9.4, answer the questions. So, just to recap. By now, you should be able to explain where paper money came from. Second, you should be able to explain fractional reserve banking. Third, you should be able to explain why governments started issuing their own paper money. Fourth, you should be able to evaluate the differences between metallic money and paper money, which is this here. And fifth, you should be able to summarize the history of the gold standard in the United States. Alrighty, Mr. Chris, out. I hope you all stay safe, stay sane, stay inside. Have a wonderful day.